Well, hi, everybody. I'm really, really happy to be here. And let me just pop my my slides up. That should be now visible. Okay. Um, so let me just start with a little bit about who I am and how I got here. I work for an organization called the Center for Civic Design. We believe that democracy is a design problem. And so we work on all of those materials, the letters, the forms, the websites, everything that election offices provide for voters. I got started in my career before this as a UX person. I was a design researcher, and I wrote a book called A Web for Everyone that was published by Rosenfeld Media. It's our accessibility book written with Sarah Horton. And I brought a lot of that into elections. I guess I would say that I was one of those people who thought accessibility was a great thing and everybody ought to do it and it ought to be there. But it wasn't until I got into elections that I really began to understand just how important it is and just how exciting it is when it works well, because elections are one of the places that have some pretty strong laws that require polling places to be accessible, information to be accessible, and for there to be options for accessible voting. The three little books that you see on the screen, you can see one titled Designing Usable Ballots, were our attempt to take a big pile of research on what usable ballots are, what accessible forms are, and all these other topics in elections, and turn them into little tiny guides that the election offices could use. So pairing up sort of great UX skills with what we know about making services accessible is kind of our mission in life, among other things. Elections have come a long way since 2000, which is when I first began paying real attention to design and elections, back in when we had this presidential election and hanging chads were the topic of the day. That's because on your left side of the screen, one of the ways that people used to vote was to have a punch card, like an IBM computer punch card, placed behind a machine, and they would take a stylus and stick a hole in it for the person they wanted to vote for. You can just see how much problems that would be. It's not accessible, it's not very usable, and it turned out it was really easy to have mistakes happen. And we had an entire presidential election kind of about that. On the right is a photograph of the new Los Angeles voting system. We're going to go deep into this a little bit later in the session, but you can, if you can see the picture, you can see that it's sort of beautifully designed. The whole industrial design of it is really great. There's a tactile keypad built into it. It's got a touch screen, but there's also headsets sort of peeking out behind the corner of the picture. So it's designed for everyone to be able to use, no matter who they are or what their abilities are. It is now 33 years since the ADA. It's 23 years since the presidential election in 2020. And the question that I have is, why are we still talking about accessible elections at this point? There is not a lot of new technology that's needed to make this work, but there are things about how big systems work that show up in elections. So I hope that what we'll do is a little romp through some of what's happening in elections today. We'll look at some of the innovative things that I think are coming right down the pike and think about how we got here. One of the reasons why we're still talking about accessible elections today is that I still have far too often heard a question like, are there really enough voters whose disability really prevents them from voting with the voting options already available to them? Well, the answer is yes, there are really enough voters with disabilities to make a difference. And there's still a long way to go in getting from something that is nominally accessible to something that's really accessible. Let's just look at some of the data about who gets included when we think about accessible voting, because you probably quote things like some 20% of people in the United States have some form of disability. But 18 million adults over 65 have age-related disabilities that might not be counted in that thing. There are 19 million adults who have vision or dexterity disabilities, which affect their ability to handle or mark a ballot. 27 million people who are eligible to vote live in households where English is spoken less than well, or live in an linguistically isolated household. That's a census term for people whose primary language is a language other than English. But the one that I like to think about is the last two, which is that 93 million literate adults, that is people who can read, that's 40%, 43% of the population read at what the National Assessment of Adult Literacy calls either basic or below basic levels. That means simple, clear information is fine. Complicated, difficult to read information, not so much. And the reason this matters is not because we have a terrible educational system. These statistics are true across the Anglosphere. It's because so much of what happens in elections and how we learn about elections and even how we read what's on the ballot is in written form. Just think about if you're in a state that puts questions on the ballot, just think about what those ballot questions, how those ballot questions read and what they sound like. And the last one is that 45 million adults are what they call low propensity or infrequent voters. That is, people who may be registered to vote, but don't show up for every election. Maybe they vote for presidential elections or they only vote for federal elections. And these are people who show up when there's something that they think relates to them to vote for. But that often leaves out their mayor, their local elections, which might not happen every year or might happen in an odd year. It might mean that they don't show up for primaries. So they don't get to take that important first step of choosing who's going to be on the ballot in November. And they're often not very civically engaged or not engaged in elections because they face barriers in their daily lives. And since accessibility is all about removing barriers, we take a very broad view of what we mean by access to voting. So I'd like to do a little trip down memory lane for a second and take us back to 1962, when two men entered university. You probably know the name Ed Roberts if you work in accessibility. He entered Berkeley. He is sort of the father of the movement for curb cuts, and had to fight for the right to enter that university. James Meredith, who's on your left, was the first Black man to be admitted to and graduate from University of Mississippi, and went on to be a major leader in the civil rights movement. It sort of struck me that these two big national rights issues sort of had a critical moment in 1962 together, because I think that when you look at the laws that we've passed in this country, the idea about expanding rights to really include all of us it has been traveling along in not in lockstep, but together through the system. And I think part of why this happens is because of a quote from one of my heroes, Glenda Watson Hyatt from the Do It Myself blog, who says, "I wrote 3 books with my left thumb." She said, "I feel like technology is finally catching up with what I truly need." So the rise of technology starting in 2005, 2006, where technology began to become portable, was connected. So all of a sudden you could have things that used to be big, clunky, and expensive assistive technology in your pocket. And it was the same device that everyone else had in their pocket. And I think this has really changed our expectations of what we carry from our daily life into our voting life. So I think this is where we start, and you will probably have questions as we go through it in your mind, I hope you will, about why things that maybe you do every day aren't something that gets built into elections. The short answer for that is that they're getting there, but elections is a slow-moving system, right? 4 years is sort of one complete cycle. So if you think about the speed with which technology develops compared to the speed with which society changes, or a 4-year cycle to complete one complete presidential election cycle, you can see how it's a little bit behind. So that leads to one of my favorite quotes, which is, "The future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed." But I think that we're seeing some accelerations in reducing the turnout gaps and in improving the accessibility of all the things around elections in a way that's kind of exciting. And that's my one-liner on the state of accessible voting in 2023. All of this happened in part because of something called the Help America Vote Act. It was passed in 2002. It was what helped us get rid of those old punch card machines, but it also included, for the first time, an explicit requirement that in at least federal elections, voting systems shall be accessible for individuals with disabilities, providing the same opportunity for access and participation, including privacy and independence, as for other voters. This is a huge definition because it says not just kind of accessible and not just I can use the machine, but it gives an outcome, which is that you're able to vote privately, just like everyone else, and independently, just like everyone else. Now, that was 2002. We're 23, 21 years later, and let's see how we're doing. One of the things that we knew going into all of this was that there was a huge turnout gap. Not going all the way back, but in 2008, there was a 7.3% gap between people, the propensity to vote for people with disabilities and people without disabilities. And that has been narrowing. In 2012, it dropped to 5.7, snuck up again a little bit to 6.3% in 2016. But 2020 and the pandemic did something pretty amazing, which is that the kind of massive voter education and outreach that went on around how we would be able to vote during the pandemic, and the rise of voting by mail, which means that in some states everybody gets a ballot delivered to their home that they can return. There was a huge drop in the turnout gap in 2020, down to 3.6%. This is finally moving in the right direction, and we're finally getting to a place where we can begin to see closing that gap as a possible goal and not just an impossible one. This work, by the way, is done by Lisa Shore and Doug Cruz from Rutgers University. They've been doing this survey for many years. It's part of the work of a federal agency called the Election Assistance Commission, which, among other things, is charged with collecting best practices and doing research to understand the state of elections in the United States. The other thing that's kind of exciting in that report is that the self-reported difficulty of voting has also declined really radically, from 11.4% in 2020, from 26.1% in 2012 to 11.4% in 2020. Now, that's still higher than people who don't have a disability, who report numbers like 7.4% down to 6.4. But as you can see, the gap is changing, the proportional gap is changing. So we're getting closer to the numbers that everybody reports of having some kind of difficulty voting, rather than it being such a huge gap between voting, between yes and no. In 2023, I got appointed to a federal committee called the Technical Guidelines Development Committee, such a boring name, but we were charged with developing the federal voting system guidelines. They're called voluntary because the states have to adopt them, so the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines, or VVSG. And they were the first time that we had full accessibility guidelines at all. The prior guidelines from the late 1990s mentioned accessibility and said it was important to have, but there were no real strict requirements that addressed technology, and there were no requirements for how usable that device was, or that system was. That they were passed in 2005, and we've been working since then. There was a big gap while we sort of all waited, but version 2 came out in February of 2021. This was a big jump. A lot of things happened in there. One of the things that happened was that we stopped separating. Sorry, I've lost my place. We've stopped separating the accessibility requirements and the usability requirements and the technical requirements. So that means that every voting system approved under these federal guidelines will be accessible. It also explicitly included that systems that maybe weren't directly covered by the VVSG, but were part of the voting experience, or if part of the voting system was online. For instance, if you could download a ballot from the website to then mark it, that those had to be, if they didn't in addition to meeting the VVSG requirements, they had to meet the Section 508 WCAG 2.1 requirements. So we began to bring in the other federal laws. And a lot of other work that we did was evidence-based updates that were based on reports of problems during the previous elections and changes and newer research. So for example, in the version 1, we said you should use sans serif type. But for version 2, we actually said you had to use sans serif type. And this was based on a lot of research that had been done into the type for dyslexia, type for people reading English whose first language may not be an alphabetic language, and for clarity of reading on screen. So we were able to bring in some of the newer research that had happened during that time. We also extended and clarified the guidelines around text size. We made the default text size a little bit larger and gave it a little bit more of a range. The original guidelines said there was one that had to be 3.5 millimeters or 10 points to maybe 16 points, and then another that had to be 24 to 25. And it turned out that the type size that most people wanted on their ballot and on their voting system was in that middle gap that was not being that was neither the small text nor the large text. So having a slightly more nuanced range of text sizes doesn't seem like a big deal, but it really is, because one of the most frequent complaints about ballot design is just that everything is so small on it. We also updated and added gestures, paying very careful attention to what kinds of gestures would be allowed. So we wanted simple gestures that were well-known, that didn't require complex movements, and were easily to understand in the scope of a ballot. We added requirements for how messages and information are communicated, making sure that if there's a sound, there's a corresponding visual, and if there's a visual, there's a corresponding sound. And we also updated the reach and touch guidelines to meet the revised access board guidelines, because wheelchairs themselves have gotten bigger in this time. And if you need to leave space in the voting booth for not only a person who might be using a large wheelchair, but perhaps an assistant who comes with them, you need to expand that floor space that's required. Oops. The other thing that we did was begin to think about modes of interaction. So one of the requirements, one of the principles is that within any method of voting, all display formats, including the ability to adjust the visual and including all interaction modes, including tactile and limited dexterity, must have the same functionality as the visual format and touch mode of voting, verification, and casting your ballot. So we very explicitly said nothing can be left out, right? You have to cover modes of interaction, modes of communication, and you have to be able to have it the same for everyone, no matter which combination of modes that they've required. So that's kind of the sort of legal and technical background. So you can see that the standards are sort of creeping up on really understanding what makes a good voting experience for someone with disabilities, and then trying to instantiate that in the requirements so that it doesn't get lost as times go on. If something is working, we wanted it in the requirements so we didn't never backtracked. If something wasn't working, we wanted to push it towards something that would work better. Most of the accessible voting systems are what is called ballot marking systems. Now, HAVA requires, the Help America Vote Act requires that every in-person polling place have at least one accessible voting system. This was often honored, sort of. That is, there would be an accessible voting system, but there were many reports over the years. People would show up at their polling place and it wasn't even turned on. Or it was a direct recording machine. So it was an electronically recorded vote where everybody else had a paper ballot that could be recounted properly. But we're beginning to sort of settle in on ballot marking systems. And I want to just talk through what those are and show you how that works. But one of the other changes that we're seeing in elections in 2023 is more states doing what Maryland does and what some of the counties around Chicago do, which is rather than saying everybody's going to vote this way, and if you need that thing in the corner, you can go vote on that machine, and just offering every voter the chance to ask if they'd rather mark their ballot on paper or they'd rather mark their ballot on screen. And it turns out that somewhere between 35 and 60% of people choose either one, one or the other. So there's some really great things that happen when that happens. One is that something that's used by more people is more likely to be turned on, running, and ready to work. It means that it's not as easy to identify the votes of people with disabilities. It means that you get all the advantage of on-screen marking and still get a paper ballot. So here's what a system looks like. First, you'll come in and you will mark your ballot using a touchscreen or the tactile equivalent of a touchscreen, going contest by contest. The voting systems can prevent what are called overvotes. That is, when someone votes for too many candidates than are allowed. And that's bad. I mean, it's good that they prevent it. It's bad to overvote because your vote doesn't count in that contest. But it can also give you warnings of whether you skipped a race, for instance, or whether you voted for too few people, so it can help you vote fully. And it lets you change your mind easily. So if you accidentally mark the wrong person and then realize you've got it wrong, it's easy to change, unlike a paper ballot. Also, because they can have audio, someone who doesn't read well can use the audio for that reason. Someone who doesn't read English well can use it. And of course, it's really easy, much easier to switch languages on a screen than it is on a paper ballot, because paper ballot isn't already provided at your polling place in your language, then that's a problem. That then gives a review screen. This is actually part of the federal requirements, that you get what's called a second chance to check that what you have voted for is who you intended to vote for before you cast your ballot. And then they print the ballot. The ballot might look like a typical hand mark ballot with the little circles that you fill in, but it might look like the ballot you see on the right side of your screen, where each contest is listed and the selection is listed. So for President and Vice President of the United States, Martin Patterson and Clay Refever from the Labor Party. This ballot is the official ballot, and it's then cast somewhere, either in a box next to the system or at a central or at a scanner in the precinct. So that's the basic. So that's why it's a ballot marking system, right? That's the basic thing about it. And there are a lot of different models for them. So there's several vendors who make them, and they look a lot of different ways. I'll just sort of talk through them one by one. The one in the upper left corner is the original one. It's called the AutoMark. It's still in use in a lot of places. It's got the printer built in, so you can mark the ballot and print it out without having to touch the ballot. The thing next to it is called the Express Vote. It's also interesting because it's a self-contained thing where the printer is inside it, and it's small enough to be used for curbside voting, which is really helpful for people with mobility disabilities. And the one on the table is a model where you've got the screen where you mark it, but there's a separate printer, and it's just a regular commercial printer with the tactile keypad and headphones shown in between. Nice thing about these is that they're less expensive, and so you can afford to have more of them in a polling place. In fact, in Georgia and a couple of other states, everybody votes on one of these. Below, there's some pictures of tactile keypads. They basically include dual switch, so just a yes and a no, or an up and a down. Some of them are quite complicated with 5 or 6 different buttons, so a minimum of 5, up, down, left, right, and enter. Might have a dedicated button for help. And they allow people to move through that thing, through the ballot, marking it with a tactile device. So now I want to come back to sort of where we are at the leading edge with the Los Angeles system. This system came about because Los Angeles needed to replace their punch cards and started looking at what they could buy, decided there was nothing that would serve a jurisdiction as large as they have. They have 5 million voters. I think they would be the 7th or 8th largest state if they were their own state. And they began to work on what the requirements would be and what they would need. They worked with the industrial design company IDEO on that research and on the industrial design, adopted it and put it into use in 2020. So it's really quite new still. I think it's just beautiful. If you are someone who lives in Los Angeles, I hope you take the opportunity one day to go to a vote center instead of voting by mail to see them, because they're designed with the kind of finish you would expect from a technology product, not what we've often seen from election products, which is functional but not beautiful. Looking at it from the front and the back, oops, look, damn it, Susan. Looking at it from the front and the back, you can see that there's a ballot box behind there. So someone could actually vote on the system without having to touch the paper, but still being able to review it. But the most important, so it's got and cast at the voting station. But the most important thing about this voting system was how it was designed, which was through incredible amounts of consultation with all kinds of voters in the county, including voters with disabilities. They did testing not just once or twice, but pretty constantly through the development process. You can see the picture on the far left was an early prototype. It's not really a finished design, but it was a mock-up. So they were thinking about how close you could get in a wheelchair. Could you reach everything? Was it comfortable to use? Was the screen large enough to get big enough type on it? And made sure that they brought in a wide variety of people and consulted with a wide variety of disability advocacy groups. So very much everything we say about ensuring that people with disabilities are included in the process. But the part that I love the most about all this testing is that they didn't bring in outside groups to do it. Much of this work was done by the staff of the election office themselves. And even when they did work with IDEO on some of the larger scale tests, they were there right with them. That means that all of that knowledge and all of the chance to interact with people with so many different disabilities remained inside the election office, and of course is still there today, informing how they think about setting up a polling place, how they think about interacting with voters, and so on. So, I guess the last thing I would say is that this is not just used, will not be just used in Los Angeles. The company that actually manufactured the device is now beginning to create a commercial product that any other election office could buy. So it was a big lift and a huge investment that I hope that we'll see used in many places across the country. Twice. So let's think about where we go from here. Elections clearly need innovation. So we're not going to get innovation by just saying, let's do the same thing a little bit more accessibly. We're going to do this. We're going to get innovation by beginning to think about how we can think about the problem differently. I'll credit one of my colleagues at the Access Board for what I'm going to say next, which is that they think about accessibility as moving from accommodation, which is illustrated by a sign that says ring bell for voting assistance. These are little stands that election officials put up at the front door if the building where the polling place is located has steps or is somehow not accessible. And someone will come out and take you around to the accessible entrance or come out and bring you a ballot that you can vote from your car at the curbside or sitting on the curbside. That's an accommodation, right? In the middle, we have sort of accessibility. There's a photograph of a gym where a guy is standing at a voting booth, but there's also a table with what's clearly a ballot marking device set up. So we have the accessible machine and the non-accessible machine kind of side by side, which is great. But what we really want to get to is universal design. And again, there's a picture of the Los Angeles system. This again was an early 2018 prototype before they did the final manufacturing. I actually wish that they hadn't changed the white. I love the white, but it's okay. The gray is nice too. And so just want to talk about a few new ideas that are coming up and what they might mean for the future of voting. If you haven't read the news or you're not from America and haven't had a chance to experience this, there have been lots of changes in voting in the last 4 years. Automatic voter registration. So rather than having to go down to the office and get a paper form, you can register. Well, we've been able to register for 20 years at the motor vehicles office, but making it easier and more proactive to do. Restoration of rights if you've been arrested and jailed on a felony. Same-day registration, because We know that voting is a habit, and maybe you moved and you forgot that you need to re-register to when you're at your new address and it's election day in a growing number of states. You can just go to the polling place, register to vote, and vote on the same day. Expanded early voting. I think this is really important for many people, but especially people with disabilities who have good days and bad days, because if you want to go vote in person, it gives you the opportunity to say, this is a day I'm feeling good and I will go vote today. Or this is a day when my kids are at school and I have a few free minutes, or I'm driving by this. In fact, vote centers now in some places allow you to vote anywhere in your county, not just at an assigned polling place. So on your lunch hour, on your way to or from work, on your way to and from your daily errands, what is convenient, it makes voting convenient. But I don't mean convenient in a sort of light way. I mean something that you can fit into your life because it should be part of daily life. And of course, we've seen better accessible voting systems. I had a chance to work with a state that was testing new systems, and we did the accessibility testing, or part of the accessibility testing, by doing some actual voting sessions with voters with disabilities and reporting back on that. And the first report that we did was full of all the little tiny problems that we'd found. And the official in charge of the project looked at me and said, please tell me these machines are better than the ones we're replacing. And they were miles better than replacing, say, a punch card or a big lever machine that's a big mechanical system. And it made us remember that we had to not just think, what's the distance that left, but how far have we come? And the biggest change, I think, is vote by mail. Going into 2020, there were 3 states that mailed a ballot to all voters. And now there are 9, and that list is growing. There are all kinds of reasons why voting by mail is helpful for many people. For one thing, the best way for you to plan how to vote is to get to see your ballot. The other is that it has traditionally been in most states, even if they require an excuse to vote by mail or vote absentee, as it's sometimes called, that people with disabilities can automatically get that because it addresses mobility and health issues. But when it's a universal option, we want to make sure that that option too is accessible. And that's led to something called accessible vote by mail, or AVBM, which are systems where you can download your ballot, you can mark and print, mark and vote on your own technology. So whatever your AT setup is, then print that ballot and mail it back like all other ballots. And we're beginning to see electronic return in a few states, sometimes limited to people with what are now called print disabilities. So if you can't see or handle paper. I've put this movie, the screen from a public service announcement by Disability Rights California from a few years ago, because I think it's a really good description of it. And at the end, we'll post all these links so that you don't have to try to read them off the screen. And I love the quote that it means that somebody in their comfortable space can vote privately, independently, like everyone else can. We talk about kitchen table voting, but maybe it's my AT voting. What are the... I'm sorry, I've just completely messed this up. Tracy, is my screen back? I'm sorry.
It is, Whitney. We're seeing expansion of options for voting.
Thank you very much. I don't know what I clicked on. Another kind of flexibility that we're seeing is this ability to pre-mark your ballot and bring that in. In the Los Angeles system, it's called a poll pass, or sometimes the interactive sample ballot. And the idea is that you can mark it at home, but if you want to come into a polling place to vote, you can bring something like a boarding pass has a QR code that you can read into the system, look at the review screen, print and cast like everyone else. And it gives you this chance to kind of take your time to do it. This was, of course, very important in California, where they vote on a lot of ballot questions. And we see people using this in a lot of different ways, including when the line builds up, people get out their phone and just sort of mark their choices and speed the line up that way. But also it gives you a chance to go through, I think the first election they used this, there were 17 questions. That's a lot to read and look at in the voting booth. We've talked about accessible vote by mail a little bit. I just wanted to show you a little bit of what a screen like that might look like. It really just looks like any sort of electronic interface. Last year, 34 states offered it, and I think it was 9 states that offered electronic ballot return. We also began looking at what makes more accessible paper ballots. Like, can you make a paper ballot that you could use an OCR program or use your phone to read your results? And what are the qualities of the type and the layout that make it both good to read visually and easy to scan, but also easy to use paper-based assistive technology so that you can know what you've actually voted for without relying on somebody else to read it for you. One of the sort of burning questions in elections is whether people really do check their ballot or not. The paper that's listed below here was a review of all the different research into how people verify. And it turned out that, some people didn't. Some people sort of trusted that they had done it right the first time and didn't double check the machine, but some 75% at the top end of some of the research did. But more importantly, although the worst report was about 5% of people actually being able to find errors, but in the good systems, up to 86% of people in a research environment were able to find an error that had been infiltrated into their ballot. So we begin to see that people not only want to and can check the ballot if we make that the normal course of action, but they can find errors when they do. I was doing an observation project with a new voting system last November. About 110 people voted on the new system. And one of the things it had was a review screen at the scanner. So you put your ballot into the scanner and it popped up a list of what you were voting for. We, of course, couldn't read the screen, but we were across the room and we could see what people were doing. And we could see that they were scanning through it and looking at it. And we know that they found problems because 5 people, one discovered that they hadn't voted on the second side of their ballot. One looked at something and said, I left off somebody. I went to go back and fix it, and other issues like that. And it meant that that's 5% of the people were able to fix and correct their ballot by being able to have that review screen as a final check. The other thing that's coming along that's new is what we call encryption technology. How do we make sure that the way we mark the ballot and the way we cast that ballot is actually how that ballot got counted? A team of open source, there's an open source project that Microsoft is promoting called Election Guard that builds that technology into a voting system. We've been talking about it since 2006, and there's now 2 projects that are working on actually building it into a voting system. We made an early prototype of it, and we were thinking, how can we make this more accessible as well? And those of you who are gamers might recognize in the picture on the right that the control pad is actually an Xbox adaptive controller, an Xbox AT, that's built into a sort of case, so that we're using these big paddles, one for move up or down, one for select, and then a little four key for up, down, and back and next. We tested this with a small number of people, but all kinds of people, and they would just sit down and go, "This is just fun." I mean, it was easy. It was easy whether you were or weren't a gamer or whatever your dexterity ability were. And the little row of circles on the far right are actually plugs that allow you to plug in your own AT to emulate all those functions. Now, this was just a research prototype. It's not going to be out for, it's not going to be in a voting system in your polling place anytime soon, but it does show that the same kind of work that's going into the able gamers work might show up in how we think about designing universally interactive systems for all kinds of things, maybe not just for voting systems, but other interactions with government. The other picture is a little paper-based handout that we made in the polling place. And we sort of love this because it let us think about how to communicate new ideas in elections. It turned out that no one wanted to hear about all the technology. They just wanted to know what they needed to do and what this technology would do for them. One of our metrics as we observed people in this voting was how many of these ended up in the trash can. And the answer was that none did. And we were pretty excited about that because it means that we're really beginning to think about how to make something that is not just a technically sufficient experience, but a great experience. And my last example is from some work we've been doing on accessible information. Accessible information, but information about how to vote accessibly. We're doing a small research project partnering with AAPD and RevUp. We made something in 2022 that we called Accessible Voting. It was based on a site we'd done in 2020 with a team called Healthy Voting. And it looked at all of the basic voting information: how, when, where, and why you could vote, what the election day was, polling place hours, but also included a lot of information specifically for people with disabilities, like for accessible vote by mail, what kind of system is available in your state if one is whether there was curbside voting, and a list of questions you can ask, and then all of the resources for assistance. And simultaneously, RevUp was creating a similar 50-state thing that was more narrative, looking at some of the big issues and having links. And we're working on how to merge the data sets and think about if we could create something that was a central national sort of database of what options are available for voters with disabilities. Would this be something that would help close the turnout gap? So to close, I just want to say, we have to stop thinking about voting with a disability as something that people need assistance with, or those poor, all the terrible things that people say about people with disabilities, and really start to think about it, that voting with a disability is a civil right, just like voting is a civil right. And that doesn't just mean the voting system. It means accessible information. It means having the forms accessible. It means having polling places accessible and having voting systems accessible, so that people really can not just mark a ballot, but mark, verify, and cast their ballot when and where they want to vote. So I hope that this has been a little bit helpful, sort of laying out some of what's going on. And we're going to pop all of these links into the chat so that you can grab them that way.
Thank you so much, Whitney. What a great job. Our attendees have enjoyed your content as well and have lots of questions for you. So
awesome.
I'm just going to jump right in. Yes, thank you. I did pop those links in the chat for all of you who are joining, so hopefully you're able to access those. But let me start with our first question. First question is there a U.S. state, or excuse me, is there a U.S. state that you feel has demonstrated a strong commitment to accessible voting where we learn from their work?
A lot of them have in a lot of ways. I think California has been a real leader in laws. And of course, this project in LA is 25% of the voters in that state. And I think they've been an inspiration around the state. I think Minnesota has done some great work, especially on their state information, and in not just people with disabilities, but also people with language access needs. And I'm not going to call out any other states, because I think I could probably go through almost all the states and tell you something great that they've done, and I could tell you something that I wish they'd done.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, how can inaccessible news websites impact elections? And there's a second part of that, is how can elections news on news websites or apps be made more accessible?
Wow, the press is really an important part of how people learn about elections. There's no question about that. I mean, more people are going to get their news from their local news website or newspaper or television station than are going to go to the county election office to look up that information. I don't know how we solve the problem about how flashy and often unusable and often not accessible those sites are, but I think the thing that can help solve the problem is making sure that the election offices themselves and all of the advocates and get out the vote groups include, not only make their own information accessible, but include information about accessible voting. It's the usual uphill battle.
Thank you. All right, next question. having different ballot layouts and different ways to mark a ballot county to county leaves a lot of room for error and oversight. Do you see any possibility of ballot marketing system standardization in the US? And what are some impediments to standardization and greater regulation?
Well, if you're asking, should there be a national voting system? I'm not sure that that's ever going to happen, and I'm kind of not sure that it's the best thing. I mean, right now, because there's some variation, problems get sort of, or localized, right? Imagine if everybody in 2000 had been voting on those punch card ballots in California, in Florida. So there's that, but I do think that we're seeing some convergence on how to design them. So the differences are there's just fewer differences between the systems. And I do credit some of the work of not only advocates across the country who have been working on talking to their election office about this, letting them know how important this is, but also the national standards. Though the 2.0 version was developed not by a group of people in a back room, but by an open workshop process. An open working group process, where for the better part of a year, we went through sort of requirement by requirement, and people brought in problems with it, people brought in ideas for expanding it, and they brought in stories about how the current state of affairs was not being well served by the current requirements, and that led to the 2.0 requirements. I also think that there's a really important room for the federal government and local government that's not just the election office to be part of the communications and to be part of doing things like making sure that people are registered to vote, making sure that there are polling places that are accessible, because government buildings are often quite accessible, right? So if we think of it as something the entire society has to do, I think we have more resources available.
Great, thank you. All right, next question for you. Within the past few years, we've watched more legislators in America advocating towards the in-person paper ballot mode of voting. How do we build trust in accessible voting-related products and also ensure that those with disabilities are not scapegoated for using an unfamiliar system?
When you say unfamiliar system, well, okay, I'll answer the question one way, and then there's another possible interpretation of it. I think that we're seeing a little bit of a crazy time where I think people have lost some faith in government, and they're not always picking on right things. I think that vote by mail, for instance, is not an insecure way to vote, nor is voting on a ballot marking device. But I am seeing some states move forward and some states not move forward as quickly. And I'm not always sure that it matches to the politics. So part of it is speaking up. I think having individuals be advocates for themselves, for their community, and making it visible in their local district. When people say, well, we just don't have that many people with disabilities in our polling place, I think that's not true. And in fact, when we were testing systems in that state, one of the people we also tested with groups of poll workers to make sure that they could operate or set up the systems with all their accessible features. And in the course of a 45-minute session, in fact, the very first one, people started saying, wait a minute, this might mean that what they called our assisted voters would be able to vote on their own. So when I think people are given a chance to see it up close and personal, some of that goes away. I think what we're seeing in states like Maryland that ask everybody if they want to have their own choice about how they want to vote, that people roughly half take each choice. I think those begin to change things. And I think that it is important that we don't segregate one type of voter and force them into one way of voting when everybody else has lots of choices. I hope that got at the question you were trying to ask.
I think it did. Thank you very much. And that actually, with that, we are out of time. So this will conclude our session for today. But again, I just wanted to thank you, Whitney, for bringing this to us. And it's great discussion. Everybody in the chat is just loving the discussion and all of the information that you've shared. So thank you very much. And thank you to all who have joined us. We hope that you enjoy the rest of AxCon.